Welcome to Downtown Sports. My name is Downtown Steven Brown, and in today's video, guys, we're going to be talking about Nick Robertson. But before we get into where Nick Robertson's going to be playing next season, I think it's important to understand why we're talking about Nick Robertson. Why is this a big deal? He was the Maple Leafs' second round pick in the 2019 NHL entry draft. He's 5'9", 164 pounds, one of those small Kyle Dubas forwards again, but he racked up 55 goals in 46 games in the Ontario Hockey League last season for the Peterborough Petes and collected 86 points as well. He's the number one prospect in the Maple Leafs' system, and he did that scoring 55 goals in 46 games in the Ontario Hockey League, primarily as an 18-year-old because this guy's birthday is September the 11th. If Nick Robertson was born just 4 days later, he would have been eligible for the 2020 NHL draft, and that's kind of mixed opinions on where he would have gone in this year's draft class. I mean, if we're looking at direct comparisons here, Jack Quinn from the Ottawa 67s was selected by the Buffalo Sabres top 10 in this past year's NHL entry draft, the 2020 draft, and Nick Robertson scored 3 more goals than him in several less games. And if you're looking at the birthdays there, September 19th, 2001, they are separated by just 8 days. And I'd like to point out that Jack Quinn was not the highest scoring player on his team last year. He wasn't even the second highest scoring player on his team last year. Nick Robertson led the Peterborough Petes in goal scoring and in points by a wide margin, and the guy in second there is also a Toronto Maple Leaf prospect, Semyon Darganchinsnev. Nick Robertson also took on a larger penalty killing role with the Peterborough Petes last season, so this is a guy that's well-versed and can do it all. Does he go ahead of Jack Quinn at number 8? Does he go at number 8? Does he go a little bit after him? Size does play a factor, and Jack Quinn is about 6 feet tall and 170 pounds and will grow a little bit. Nick Robertson's 5'9" and 160 pounds or so that does play a factor into it, but he was the more productive player. And not just by a little bit, by a lot. I flashed it a little bit earlier here, but these are individual goal-scoring years in the Ontario Hockey League sorted by goals per game, and Nick Robertson is 7th on this list just all time for his 2019-2020 season in terms of goals per game with 1.196. If Robertson would have played the same number of games as Jack Quinn last season, he would have been on pace for 74 goals. And if Nick Robertson did hypothetically score 74 goals last year, that would put him in 5th place for the most goals in an OHL season ever, bumping John Tavares' miraculous 16-year-old season where he scored 72 goals in the Ontario Hockey League. Just an absolute freak. But if you're looking at the other players that would be ahead of Nick Robertson if he hypothetically scored 74 goals, Robertson would have done it as an 18-year-old. Some of the guys there are 19, and that is a huge difference in terms of the Ontario Hockey League and junior hockey. He was the best goal scorer in the Ontario Hockey League last season, and he had one of the most efficient goal scoring seasons in OHL history, and he did it while leading his team. So why is this a problem here? Well, Nick Robertson is 19 years old, and you have to be turning 20 by at least the end of December in order to be eligible to be playing in the American Hockey League. So right now, as I'm filming this video, he is not eligible to play in the American Hockey League. So Nick Robertson would be too good to go back to the Ontario Hockey League, even if there wasn't talks of the Ontario Hockey League not being allowed to have physical contact or hitting allowed. But what I will tell you is that if the OHL is forced to play without hitting, the OHL is not an option for Nick Robertson next season. So you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, well, this is easy then. If the American Hockey League is not an option, the OHL is not an option, and he's so great, why doesn't he just play for the Toronto Maple Leafs? This is a quote from James Myrtle from Kyle Dubas, and this is from the middle of October. Things are always subject to change, and that will be a topic that we're going to discuss a little bit later. Things are subject to change. Kyle Dubas says he doesn't anticipate needing to shed any more players to create cap room, says the Leafs may use a 20-player roster at times. Now, a 20-player roster might just be a fantasy idea. We might just be reading into it too much. Maybe it never happens. Like I said, that quote's from the middle of October. Things are always subject to change. We don't even know when the NHL season is starting yet. Now, there's a lot of things that we will just have to wait and see how they unfold, but for the purpose of this hockey channel, that wouldn't be very entertaining if I just said that we need to talk about the hypotheticals and the what-ifs and the what-have-yous. And if he is granted special privileges to play in the American Hockey League, then that's great. I don't have a problem with necessarily starting him off there if there's not room right away for him on the NHL roster. And it's not that I don't think that Robertson is good enough to be on the team next year. No, I do. We just have to go with the information that we have. And Kyle Dubas suggesting that the Leafs might go with a 20-man roster might be problematic for having Robertson on the team. And that has everything to do with who's exempt from waivers and who's not. So I've had this page open in the background for a while now, and Nick Robertson, like you see, is exempt from waivers, and there's a couple of other players who are also exempt from waivers. So guys like Mikko Lehtinen, although I don't think that they're going to send him down. Rasmus Sandin is also exempt from waivers. Pierre Engvall is also exempt from waivers, and then there's a bunch of other guys who are all exempt from waivers. And the idea and reason why you would even consider having a 20-man roster is to save every single possible dollar you can. If the American Hockey League team is traveling with the Leafs, what's the purpose of having healthy scratches? Just send them down. If you have a taxi squad or expanded rosters available to you, why are you keeping guys on your active roster that you're not necessarily using on a day-to-day basis? All you're doing is paying them an NHL salary when you don't necessarily have to. And if you're paying them an NHL salary, then that's costing you cap space. And now that the Maple Leafs don't expect to be using long-term injury reserve or LTIR, so what they were doing with Nathan Horton and David Clarkson for an extended period of time, it's going to make it easier for the Maple Leafs to make in-season moves. When you're using or flirting with long-term injury reserves, it makes it very, very difficult to make trades in season. And the year that they acquired Jake Muzzin, if you go back and look at it, they didn't use LTIR that season at all. Because having $1.3 million in cap space on day one of the season is not the same as having $1.3 million on trade deadline day. Because by then, everyone's cap hit becomes prorated because they've already been paid out a certain percentage of the money that they're owed that season. So that $1.3 million is really 60 or 70% more by the time the deadline rolls around. And like I said, not having guys on your active roster on a day-to-day basis that you're not necessarily using will save you cap space. And because the salary cap isn't a thing come playoff time, once you fit everyone under it after the final day of the season, who cares? Call everyone up and have a 23-man roster. And if the Maple Leafs do go with a 20-man roster at different times this season, they're more than likely going to go with 11 forwards and 7 defensemen. And that's because none of these guys, except for Mikko Lehtinen, and you're not sending him down, are exempt from waivers. If you send any one of these guys down or move them off of your active roster onto your taxi squad or your expanded rosters, then you're probably going to be subjecting them to waivers. And going with 11 forwards and 7 defensemen will allow you to play guys like Jason Spezza and Joe Thornton on the wing on a more regular basis, and maybe you get a little bit more minutes or a little bit more mileage out of them this season. And people are probably going to point to a guy like Alexander Barabanov and say, why would he leave Russia to come here if the Maple Leafs didn't promise him to play games? And to that, I would say things are always subject to change. When the Leafs signed Barabanov, they didn't necessarily think that Joe Thornton was going to be an option for them. They didn't know about Jimmy Vesey. They didn't know whether Wayne Simmons was coming here or not. They didn't know whether they were going to be able to trade Kasperi Kapanen or Andreas Johnsson by that time. You just don't know. Things are always subject to change. So the third option for Nick Robertson is playing in Europe. But the problem with him going to Europe is that the Leafs can't micromanage or manage his development. They can't control how many minutes he's getting on a nightly basis. They can't control his role on the team or his nutrition or the facilities that he has access to. But this is interesting, and I think that it's something that Kyle Dubas and MLSE are going to have to look into, because this is just absolutely brilliant here. The same ownership group that owns the LA Kings conveniently also owns a team in Germany. So the LA Kings have been able to send all of their top prospects over to play in the German Hockey League, and while the German Hockey League is not one of the top-end leagues in Europe, it's still a professional hockey league. And while they wouldn't be able to shuttle Nick Robertson back and forth between the Leafs and this European team, it's a loan. He's not there permanently for the entire season. It's whatever the Leafs in this hypothetical team would arrange for and work out. Semyon Dargin-Chinstev, who I mentioned earlier in the video, played with Nick Robertson on the same line in Peterborough. He is already playing for a team in the KHL right now, so maybe that team could also house Nick Robertson, and he would have a familiar face there. They could play on the same line and further each other's development even more in a professional men's league instead of just the OHL. And the reason why I think Nick Robertson isn't already with a European team right now is because he's eligible to be playing in the World Junior Championships this year, which are going to be taking place in about a month from now. And also because NHL training camp would probably open up not too long after the World Juniors are over, and he has an opportunity to make the Leafs, right? If they can't make anything work in Europe, and the Ontario Hockey League is not an option because there's no hitting, and the American Hockey League is not an option because they're not giving him special privileges, then they might just have to suck it up and put him on the team this year because that's what would be best for his development. And if that's the case, they're going to have to throw this idea of a 20-man roster out the window. And at that point, in terms of ice time and playing games and getting into the lineup, I think it would kind of be a rotation between the 7th best defenseman and the 11th best forward and Nick Robertson. And I haven't even mentioned a guy like Pierre Engvall, who's buried here, who was a top penalty killer in the NHL last season. I don't care if that was against teams' second power play units. He had awesome stats in terms of scoring chances allowed, high danger shot attempts allowed, and goals against. That's a guy who skates moderately well and can play center. He's going to be in the mix. But the specific problems that we're talking about in terms of the Maple Leafs' roster are not bad problems. They're good problems to have. These questions, all it means is that they got some depth. But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section. What do you think happens with Nick Robertson? What is best for his development? And make sure to leave me a like on the video if you did like it, and subscribe for more because more is always on the way. And guys, remember, this is not a matter of if, but when Nick Robertson becomes an impact player on the Toronto Maple Leafs next season, because he is going to make an impact on next year's roster, whether that be in the regular season or the playoffs.